Between us, we've got 50 years of experience in endurance sport. And today we're going to use the lessons we've learned through coaching, racing, and all of those years' experience to try and bring you some really good training advice to stop people maybe making some of the same mistakes that we made, but certainly stopping people taking as long to learn them. We're going to go through four key topics that Grant and I sort of very much agree on. We thought independently about the subjects of the main things we learned we can bring to athletes, and very quickly whittled it down to four things, and we'll expand out on them as we go. Yeah, this is going to be very performance focused and hopefully very useful to people going forward. I think I'm being the elder statesman here. I'm 32 years in endurance sport. I did my first mountain bike cross country race at 14 years old. Went through a big period of cycling, then triathlon, then a little break, then triathlon again, and back full circle into cycling. Grant, how old were you when you started?
It's a good question, I guess. I started when I was also about 14, I would say. I mean, I swam since I was a little kid, right? You know, how much are you really learning? How much are you really thinking about that point? 14 was probably when I started to take endurance sport more seriously. Certainly swimming, and then started triathlon when I was about 15, 16. Did that for a good 15, 16 years, I guess. Yeah, be about 14, 15 years. A large percentage of that racing professionally, and then I retired from that. Running a lot now, trying to get fast at that. So lost time in the sport similar to Phil. Yeah, and I guess, you know, this topic, this podcast, all we've seen over the years is lots and lots of these mistakes are the same things over and over again. Like you know, endurance sport is a very simple thing to get better at, but you know, there's a right way. There's little things that you pick up along the way that are probably quite hard lessons at the time, but you know, you quickly figure them out, or you maybe in some circumstances, certainly I know for myself, you take a long time to figure it out. And yeah, as Phil said, hopefully we can kind of short circuit that route a little bit today.
Yeah, I think one of the things, I mean, I've obviously been coaching for a very long time now as well. And I think an observation of something that maybe makes a good coach as well is always observing. So, you know, both of us have been around other athletes and other coaches for a very long part of our life. We've seen lots of mistakes. We've seen lots of things done really well. We've seen the outcome of, you know, and I think one of the ones that people maybe struggle to see as much, but it is observable, is when someone's training in a certain way or with a certain, I don't even want to say method, maybe just a mentality, or, and you maybe think at the time, there's a flaw in this is going to go badly, and actually, yeah, 6 months later, 12 months later, you know, actually you can look back far enough to see that there was probably some mistakes in the way training was, whether it's 2 months, 6 months, 12 months ago, that leads on to the problems, whether that's injury, burnout, not getting the results you want. And I think I think it is a trait I sort of look for, you know, when working with other coaches is, are they? I'll tell you a really simple one now. We're right in training camp season. Is you ride with a group on camp, and you always observe, you know, the way people ride a bike, handle a bike, how their bike is set up. Then you run with them, and you know how the mechanics are. Then you go to the dining room with them, and you're not obviously like watching people with a beady eye on what you're eating. But over the course of the week, you're like a sponge, and you pick all this information up, and I think over a very long period of time get to understand how it all links together, what's good, what's bad, where the red flags are, yeah, I don't know your take on that, but that's something I certainly feel working with athletes and coaches in the real world.
I think it's spot on. It's pattern recognition, isn't it? You see something happen,
And I knew you'd know the proper term for it. I just call it life, but yeah.
No, but you're spot on. I think it's why one of the best ways. I know probably not a lot of coaches listen to this, but mostly athletes. But one of the best ways to become a coach is go either be coached, or go and observe coaches at work, understand when they kind of interject, understand why they're doing certain things a certain way. And often it's because, oh yeah, I learned that 15 years ago that if you do this, then that happens. Or if you do it the way that maybe you were thinking of doing it, then this maybe less favourable outcome is going to happen. And you pick up a load of these different circumstances, and you can hopefully recognise where that's going to head, and yeah, not make the pitfalls and mistakes that potentially you might otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, let's dive in. Lesson number one from 50 years in endurance sport. And look, it is funny, isn't it, how we very much how we actually scripted this is that I scripted the things I thought of, and then you scripted that, and we realized that they basically just meshed together. So we were originally going after 8 to 10 points and realized we've probably hit the nail on the head with 4 or 5 here. So look, the first one, and I don't want to sound like other podcasts we've done in the past where we've talked about we've talked about intensity and but understanding intensity and getting it right, and being pliable to how the body is, to what the data's telling you, maybe even environmental conditions, and just having a deep understanding. And I do always think, if I understood intensity the way I do today, when I started out, I'd have been such a better athlete, so much quicker. But we're hardwired to probably push the limit all the time. Threshold sessions might be a bit too hard. Then you haven't got the legs for your VO2, so you're not getting the correct benefit, and just real muddy in the waters with what endurance work looks like, and the actual function of it. So yeah, I think I'll sort of like open up here on the intensity side of it, and go into a little bit of detail. And I will start with uh we'll start at the top. The VO2 stuff. I was actually riding in Richmond Park the other day, and I was doing a bit of an effort myself, and a guy was riding at the same effort as me. And I mean, by the time we were 2 or 3 minutes in, I worked out this guy was definitely doing a VO2 effort. He was absolutely all over his bike. Anyway, as we get to the top of this climb, he literally just peels off to the left and looks like he's nearly vomiting into the grass. And I then, as I carried on doing my session around the park, which I was using like a 15-minute loop, I saw him a few more times. And I know that climb is 3 minutes long. This guy was doing 3-minute VO2 reps, but I'd observed him in one of the early reps of the session, and he was bent over double, having to stop. And I think that's probably like one of the best examples of like maybe even session choice, 5x3, 6x3 classic session, but because of the long recoveries that he'll have on the descent on the way back down, or as you would set it as a coach, 1-to-1 work to rest recovery, there's a tendency to allow quite a bit of anaerobic contribution to this session, and you have to just understand whether or not you want the athlete to have that anaerobic contribution. I've just done a session myself this morning, 3 rounds of 4 by 2 minutes, but only with a minute recovery between them all, so that the recovery is much shorter, which means that the session is quite a lot more aerobic, and you don't run the risk, and you can't overcook it because there's no room for error. So I think with the VO2 stuff, and you see it at track as well. People, they start a group track session, 10 400s off 60-second recovery, 90-second recovery, whatever it is, and absolutely blasting every one of them. And 3 weeks later, they're going, oh yeah, I'm feeling so much faster. Of course, they're getting some neurological gain from the speed they're running at and all that kind of thing. And they will be getting some VO2 benefit, but ultimately, I think when I set VO2 for people, I'm very much thinking about the physiology of the athlete. I'm very much thinking about their mental tendencies as well, to be overcooking. I'm also making sure the athlete is very, very fresh for these sessions. I've actually just had 2 easy days leading into a substantial VO2 session, so I knew the legs would be not bad after a big weekend. And I'm also wearing a heart rate monitor. And I think, we sort of know with VO2 that, one of the big gains that we are getting is, the impact on cardiovascular system. You want to be 90 to 95% of your max heart rate to get that. What you don't need to be is 100% of your max heart rate and pulling over to the side to have to lie on the grass after rep number two. Not really the way to do these sessions. Yeah, have you got anything to add on on the VO2 side of things?
Not overly. I think you hit the nail on the head there. Training is supposed to elicit an adaptation. I think I actually think you've got two camps. You've got the group of people that always want to push to the maximum. But I think conversely, and perhaps this is a newer side to triathlon. You've got a group of people that kind of struggle to push hard. Maybe they're a little bit newer to the sport. Maybe they, aren't used to necessarily working at an intensity. I think there's definitely a balance of understanding the athlete and understanding almost, how to describe the session, how to get the intensity right for that athlete on that day, depending on kind of where they're coming from in the sport. But I think it's spot on with some sessions, particularly if they are quite intense, sometimes by making those parameters a little bit stricter, whereby exactly as you said, like if you're going too hard, if you overcook it a little bit, then you're going to pay the price and probably not be able to complete the session. Whereas if you get it just right, you'll get through it well. I think that's quite a nice way to control it, and it's quite a nice way to actually get through to somebody how controlled some training needs to be, in order for you to do a lot of it, essentially, right?
Absolutely that. Like VO2, there's a couple of things I'll add here actually. The first one is when you're setting athletes using the modern situation of workout builders and giving them numbers to hit. Very, very hard to know how the body is on the day. 10 watts either way on a VO2 session, I think is a fair window to give people. But what I'd also, one of the biggest mistakes I see, and it goes to what you were saying about maybe not being hard enough, is as you're getting fitter, and if you do, and I do find it, the session I've just done today, I've done it 3 times in the last 4 weeks, 4.5 weeks, about 10 days a session. I space VO2 work. So I found 10 watts every time I've done the session. And I think that's because I get enough stimulus from the session to get the gains without ending myself on the session. It's just, and it feels more, those extra 10 watts, they're coming at the same RP, they're coming, feels very aerobic, even at a lower heart rate today. And all we're looking for is adaptation. There's no one's giving you a medal for killing yourself. They give you a medal for becoming a better athlete and winning the race. So, yeah, I think I a lot of this is to do, what we're talking about here is like having a high level of understanding. I knew what I did on the previous session. I was wearing a heart rate monitor. I know that's in the right zone. I feel this is working for me. So I'll start at the same power I did the previous session and I'll see how it's going and then move up from there. Is the heart rate the same this week? Is the RPE the same when I do this session in another 10 days time? Same story, isn't it? And it's about knowing yourself, getting back to, knowing your numbers from previous sessions, executing well and moving forward. Always trying to just get to the end. Look, I also see people not going hard enough. I go, how was that? They were like, it was about an RPE of 7. I'm like, it's a VO2 session. It has to finish at a 9. That's it can be an 8, 9, 9.5 session, no problem. And they're like, well, the numbers in the workout builder, well, if we haven't done a threshold test for 6 to 8 weeks and you've moved forward, then yep, I can adjust them for next time we do that session and move them up. But I actually, my personal view, I'm not trying to just hold all the cards and go, yeah, I'll just tweak your numbers. You don't need to think, because I'm thinking when I go to do the session, I know myself, I know my fitness, and I'm enjoying the process of knowing these numbers. Same on the run, same on the swim. It's always just about knowing yourself.
So something I quite like to do with athletes, it probably goes a little bit more, or it probably lends itself a little bit more to the run, where you don't necessarily have the same feedback as doing it in a really windy day. Do a session on a really windy day. You run one way, your pace is going to be so much faster. You run the other way, it's going to be so much slower. Or if it's not a windy day, do something on a rolling course. It really forces you to kind of go inside, right? Well, this is a threshold session. Is it threshold? This is a VO2. Okay, but I'm not on the track, so I don't know my 400 times. Does it feel like VO2? Listen, it's a hard thing to get right. I don't think anybody's denying that, and it takes time and practice. But one of those things that you need to certainly be thinking about at the start of the journey, all the way through the journey, and gradually you kind of get a little bit better, to the point where you don't even need to look at the metrics. Yeah, you can. What you want to check, they're in the right place, they're moving forward, they're moving where you want to go, but um, internally how your body's moving, how things are feeling if you're at that right intensity zone. Um,
Just all it's observation of yourself, isn't it? Not just turning up and loading some session onto Zwift or I think that's one of the dangerous ones. I think with running, I think you've always, because it's generally out in the real world, there's that you have to work out, am I getting to the end of this session? The bit people maybe aren't thinking about is, am I getting to the end of this session and it feels right at the end based off how it should do? Yeah, self-observation. So yeah, look, if we step it down to threshold, and let's use the swim to sort of talk about this one a little bit, because I think it's the same feeling throughout. I think in people's natural sports, they're a little bit better at feeling it. But I think if you do enough threshold work across three sports, then that feeling transfers over. And I mean, you go with sort of like how does threshold feel to you when you're doing it correctly?
um, it feels in control. My breathing rate is certainly increased. It's strong. It's a pace that I feel like I can hold for a good chunk of time, but know that I can't hold it forever. My heart rate is strong, but again, it's in control. It's not going up and up and up and up and up. There's some kind of flat line there. I guess the best way to describe it is solidly in control, but knowing if I pushed much harder, if I stepped it up a gear, there would be very limited time there.
Yeah, you're bouncing off the red line, aren't you? Like you're just about in control. You step over it and you're in a bit of trouble. And in general, you want to be the correct side of that line so that it feels hard, but you feel like it's like an enjoyable hard rather than an impossible hard. So yeah, if you're swimming, and I think swimming is one where you have to get the feel right, because other than some smart goggles, there's no immediate feedback in your vision, and uh, you have to just find a rhythm. It's the same with running, isn't it? Like I think when you're running at threshold, you also feel quite good rhythm as well. You feel like you're moving nicely. It's enjoyable. Same in the water. And yeah, on the bike, I think when you're at threshold correctly on the bike, you're. I get athletes sometimes say, "I was struggling to find the right gear for that." And I actually think that's when they're over the line, because they're struggling between the cardiovascular system and the muscular effort, and it's all not feeling good and it's not coming fluidly. Whereas when you're the right side of the line, I could ride at 85 RPM, 95 RPM, 100 RPM. I'm not really like because I'm in control. The minute you lose control, you start messing with the gears, and yeah, and I think, look, I think threshold is the one that most people need to improve on the most. When we look at athletes, very often I don't see VO2 as the limiter. It's the fractional utilization of the thresholds as a percentage of VO2 in a lot of people. We want to use a higher percentage of it, sustain good pace and power for long periods of time, and once you've got the VO2 up in the right place and you keep it there, there's a lot of threshold work needs to be done, and that's the other key thing. Getting the threshold work done right means you can do quite a lot of it over the course of a week, a month, a training block, whatever. Get it wrong and you won't be getting many minutes done at threshold. You feel cooked, and mentally you feel like you can't show up for the next session as well, because it's and I definitely used to. I remember years ago being set 4 by 8 minutes, and my mentality on the whole thing was wrong. 4 by 8 minutes at threshold was like, it was one of those, like, this is going to be nearly impossible, was how I thought when I was younger, and it's just not the case. The last one bites a bit now. The first one's for free, pretty much. The middle two, you know, you're still well in control. So yeah, I think that's one for athletes to really, really hone in on and understand, that if you're going to learn to do one thing, probably LT2, and being able to do it properly in order to get the best development there is the one to hone in on.
I got a little challenge that sometimes I like to set people to check that they are in the right area, and that is, see how things feel in the day. But things are feeling good. You hit the number either to the watt or to the exact pace for the interval. If you can do that, then we know that it's in control. We know that there's an element of control over the pace, over the power. If you are just going blindly hard, the session becomes, or the session controls you rather than you controlling the session. And sometimes I quite like that as a little bit of a test.
I think that's great. I mean, I reflect on the last two sessions I've done. One was threshold. I'm pretty sure every single rep, and they were step down, so there was different steps in them. They were every rep, and I was doing it outside on a climb to the watt. In fact, Mikhail Kwiatkowski, the Ineos rider, he was former world road race champion. I saw a session of his on Strava the other day, and he was in Mallorca, and he did 6 by 20 minutes climbs as 5 minutes over threshold. I mean, the numbers were ridiculous, obviously. 5 minutes at 386, 15 minutes at 362 or something. Every single rep was identical, and they were all on different climbs as he went around the island. There wasn't a watt difference, which shows the level of control. My VO2 session this morning on short reps at zone 5 power, there is definitely much more variation in those, and it's not because of the shortness. It's just because towards the end it's getting damn hard, and I think that's a really good point you just made there, and I'm going to start using that. I think that's a really good way to get people to do their threshold right.
So you heard it here first, all the fellas athletes. That's going to be in your your training peaks next week.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
do you
Yeah,
want to
look, I
chat
mean, I
about?
do. I actually have a few of them where I'm always sharing my outdoor Strava workouts with them, just to show them. Basically, it's about creating lovely patterns on your Strava, but it's not. It is actually for that exact reason. If you can't create a perfect outdoor workout, there's a lot of people are like, oh, it's loads of structure and stuff, I best do this inside. No, there's loads of ways to do stuff outside, and if you're in control, you can do them perfectly. And that's actually the point I make to these athletes is, and it's great because they fire back at me now, and they're like, and it's got them off the turbo outside, and they're making these lovely charts. In fact, one of them lives up your way, actually, young Scottish lad Tom, and he's well into it. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so look, as we move down the scale again, and let's not get too. We won't make a lecture about zone two. I think everybody hears an awful lot of zone two and how to do it properly these days. But I think the biggest thing I'd say here is When you're doing your endurance work, and that this definitely includes the pool as well, understand that what you're trying to do is, you said it earlier, Grant, you are trying to affect physiology. You're trying to make changes within the body that help support you as an athlete, endurance sport, moving more oxygen, substrate utilization changes, etc. within the body. Those things don't happen just at the upper end of zone two. They happen um, at all of the endurance zones, and let's say, for argument's sake, today below LT1 we're talking about, and look, some of these changes happen above LT1 as well. But when you're doing the longer stuff that you don't want to come home absolutely cooked for, it's building that bigger engine. um I think people are natural tendency is to go and do things as hard as they can, come back shattered even from those sessions, even though they've already done the hard sessions. And understanding that, I genuinely like to use zone one an awful lot, for people. I think, a good mix of one and two, based sometimes with age groupers as well. How do you feel today? Go and do your hours endurance run based off how you feel, thinking about what you've got coming tomorrow. I'm not bothered if that's 4:30 a k, 5 minutes a k, 6 minutes a k. I've got really good athletes come back at 7:30 a k sometimes because I'm tired, so I went really slow, and I'm amazed they can run that slow. But the high performers, so the anecdotal evidence says it works.
I think variation is definitely important there, and I have the exact same approach, to be honest, with athletes. I think there doesn't need to be a pace, there doesn't need to be a heart rate, there doesn't need to be a zone for these easy runs. See if you feel quite good and you want it to push it up to LT1 or even a little bit above on that steady run because you've got a lot of energy that day, there's space in the program, and you feel good, that's fine. But equally, if you are tired, if you've had a long, stressful day at work, just go out and plod or spin the legs super, super easy. I think it's a nice way to take a little bit of stress and take the structure away from structured training. Where you're not constantly having to follow a number. I think it's quite a nice way to do it. And
Yeah, I think.
probably,
Sorry.
sorry, Neil. I was just going to say it probably leads over onto kind of my tangent of a lesson, where that kind of intensity distribution. So Phil talked a lot about the intensity of sessions and how to control that. And my learning was that intensity kind of distribution throughout the week or throughout the kind of the month or whatever. And it was a lesson that I learned quite late in my career, where I did a lot of hard training. I think every day, maybe bar one, which was a Sunday, which was long, there was intensity. There was something really, really hard in there. And it wasn't until very, very late on in my career where I moved, had a different coach who had a different philosophy where we would go 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 days of just going steady, just doing steady volume, and then we had a hard session, whether that was threshold VO2, whatever it was. And one of the things that I noticed or I learned, my physiology started to improve a lot again. Already quite late into career, and I had energy. I had energy to do other things. I wasn't tired. I wasn't sore all the time. And I appreciate, listen, especially with age group triathlon and limited training time, the percentage of that distribution should be different. You maybe get a little bit more room to push a little bit, or certainly have a higher percentage of intensity through the week. But I think the point kind of still stands that that distribution should be favourable to the point where you've got energy to execute through them.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to try and simplify that distribution down to probably the way I said. This is a very generalized statement for most age groupers doing 8 to 12 hours a week, let's say. You absolutely need all zones within your week. Zone 5, actually, maybe doesn't need to be every single week. But I think what I'm talking about here is, include zone one within a week. There's so many things going on physiologically within the body that you do need all intensities, but you also need to recover from the harder stuff. And just don't feel like you're, for want of a better word, pussying out because I'm a bit tired tonight. I've got a run that I'd normally go, you know, uh, because my Strava needs to look like every easy run's bang on 5 minutes a K, which 5 minutes a K, weirdly, when I look at Strava, why does every age group run 5 minutes a K on Strava? It's like a number they've all got to hit, but they're not all the same runners. It's crazy. So, they're mix it up. Be happy to come back on 6 minutes a K, 6:30 a K. So, whatever kind of runner you are, just and like you said at the same time, on those days you're feeling good and it's aerobic. Well, there's still a massive amount of the most of the energy is coming aerobically, even if you're up into zone three on your steady run. The other point I'd make as well is just intensity versus duration. I could go out for a zone three ride for 40 minutes. It's not going to take much out of me. If I go and ride in zone three for 3 hours, I'm going to come back whacked. So use the lower zones on the longer days. Think about how much TSS you maybe need to, you normally accumulate in the week and how you ride in and that kind of thing. So but I think that the point is don't underestimate the value of easy and steady and the fact that physiologically, whilst they don't feel too taxing, they're doing a massively important job. Like you said, late in a career, your physiology improved by doing more easy.
Yeah.
Goes against the grain a little bit. But look, I've said to you before, I do two key sessions a week, and everything else is easy. It's definitely a reflection of mine over the years. I did too much intensity, especially when you're mixing three sports. And look, I'm not saying triathletes only do two intense sessions. I'm in single sport; it's a little bit different. And I think swimming always needs mixed paces. It's using a different set of glycogen stores as well in the upper body. There is a difference. Why there can be a little bit more intensity minutes within a triathlete week, but certainly when you're talking about what you can cope with on your legs, for example, your glycogen stores don't know the difference between whether you're running or cycling. So there's only so much you can deplete those in a week, plus also the muscle damage and the protein turnover required to recover. So that's why we have to do easy. And I think if you listen to some people, if you could do all of your training with more intensity in certain aspects of physiological development, you'd get better. But you simply can't. So once you've maxed out intensity minutes, say at threshold for the week, and that is how I actually think when I'm looking at someone's week. I'm going, 60 to 90 minutes worth of intensity for a decent athlete on the lower limbs. This might be someone doing 15 hours a week, and you know whether it's 30 to 60 minutes of intensity in the pool, and that probably includes recovery periods. That's main sets. And that's about what people can handle. And actually, the closer you are to that limit of, I mean, look, you could do up to 2 hours worth of intensity, I think, and get away with it if your fueling was spot on and you were really good at like replenishing your glycogen stores and stuff. But I think there's probably it's all about being more consistency over time, if you like, and that's plenty for anybody. I don't know if you've ever thought about those numbers before, but that's just a way I think about it sometimes when I'm looking at how much I'm putting in for someone.
Yeah, I've not got any numbers like that off the top of my head. Um, I guess the final point on maybe this point, and I think with the kind of that feeling of always going hard, and definitely this was what it was like for myself. I don't know if you would agree, Phil, and I do think a lot of people kind of go hard for this reason, and it's coming from insecurity, coming from an insecurity in your training, coming from an insecurity that you're not going to get better unless you do this, and actually taking a step back. And the most confident trainers I've ever seen know they're good. Triathlon, I think, is quite an insecure sport in a number of ways. If you go and you watch professional swimmers, they all think they're awesome. and they don't have to try. And it's a completely different mindset. But I think a little bit more confidence in doing things well consistently and not having to kind of max out will, yeah, take you 95% of the way there.
Success breeds success, doesn't it? If you've been successful, then it gives you confidence. Then you train in a certain way that breeds more success. I've seen it with training partners in the past, and I also think you could add to that what you've just said with in your weaker sports, you have even less confidence in that's general. And I know for me, if I ever got my threshold work wrong or my VO2 work wrong in training, it was more than likely on the run. Because I had to prove it to myself, to prove it to those who I was running with, and it's not the way to do it. So yeah, try to take your strongest sport where you may be getting it right, and relay it across the other three, and you'll develop in the right possible ways. Right, let's go to point two. Train your skills, not your fitness. I sort of say this thinking I might as well be talking to the wall. Everyone's going to listen and go, yeah, that's a great idea, and then go and crack on with their intense sessions. But we're talking about things that we've learned over a long period of time. If you could go back and have your time again, what would you double down on? What would you get right? This is one for me. It's all three sports. Swimming is absolutely up there in importance. Developing your skills as a swimmer, how you move, how you race, how you swim open water, is critical. How you run. We just did a whole podcast on running the other week, which was excellent. If you've not listened to it, that's my biggest regret. I talk openly about that being my biggest regret, that I didn't learn to technically be a better runner, to move different, to train my body to be more efficient as a runner. And the bike, I give an example on the bike. I actually remember being in a race with a really good athlete. We were riding together on the bike, obviously not drafting, and every single he was stronger than me without a doubt, and every single luckily there was a lot of junctions, a lot of turns, a lot of, and I just clawed all the time back. And I basically came into T2 with him because I could take corners better. And there was a lot of them. And his straight line speed and strength was way superior to mine. Don't forget, if there's a 90-kilometre bike leg, I bet you've got, on a British course, you've probably got 90 corners. If you take those 2 seconds faster than the next guy, you're 3 minutes up the road. Or you can ride 3 minutes easier in terms of the effort and run faster off the bike. So, yeah, do double down on skills. So, yeah, Grant, you're going to talk a little bit about swimming to start with, I think, aren't you?
Well, I was gonna, yeah, but you made some interesting points there. I maybe came at it from the other end. Maybe you were a little bit more of a skillful athlete, and did work on your skills, and so kind of that paid off. A bunch of the TTT crew were out in Lanzarote at the weekend, doing one of our camps, and it so happened that the short course at one of the World Cups, which is the kind of second tier of racing, was there,
Yeah.
and you know, they all went out and watched it. And one of the things, I spoke to a few people that were there and watched it, and they couldn't believe the kind of level of skill, of speed of operating over a number of these things, finding their ways through bike packs, transition skills, swim skills, all of these things. And it kind of made me reflect and think about my career a little bit. And I had a successful junior career, because I trained really, really hard. And I was very fit. As soon as I went into senior, I didn't have the skills to match it. Didn't have the skills to match it. I remember I went out to France to train. And this is what I was going to come on to from a swimming point of view, but I'll relay it on the bike as well. I went out on the bike, so lived next to the Alps. We would go out a ride, steady ride. The guys would have to wait at the bottom of the hill for me, good 5, 6 minutes at the bottom of every hill. because I wasn't good enough. Didn't have the ability to take the corners the way they did. And listen, they grew up in the Alps. They've been exposed to that, but those skills got better. And the exact same with the swimming. The swimming skills got better, and that translated into races. Now, for the vast majority of us, I think there's much more people doing long course racing than short course racing. Short course racing, I think, highlights it. Long course racing is not to be sniffed at from a skill perspective. Exactly as Phil said, like, you can make up so much energy just by being skillful, just by spending that little bit of time learning how to corner, learning how to swim, learning how to do transition a few minutes faster. People that want to go sub 10, sub 11, whatever for their Ironman and yet spend 20 minutes in transition and fumbling around with all their stuff. A little bit of practice, shave off 5-10 minutes. Much easier doing that than 5-10 minutes off a bike ride.
I'm going to give you a funny story here. Chris Standage, fellow head coach TTT, big Palmaris age group racing, triple world champion. I was out in Calp with him a good few years ago now with a good friend of ours and his son. You'll know Sergio Baxter. Races on the WTS circuit and ITU and stuff, and one of the world's best Olympic distance triathletes, and we were just out we went over the Col de Rats. We're coming down the other side, and it's quite a twisty descent down there. Anyway, we get down to the town at the bottom, and me, Sergio, and Sergio's dad are all at the bottom, and Chris is nowhere to be seen. And I'm not joking, we were stood there for 5 minutes. It was a fairly long descent. And Sergio, being a young lad, just turned around and went, thought he was meant to be good. And, we'd all ridden up the climb together, and so it's interesting that Sergio isn't judging someone and how fast they get to the top. It's how fast you get to the bottom the other side as well. Especially in that fast moving sport that you come from, where your bike skills are paramount as to the energy conservation of being good in a pack like you raced is so key to how you run because the margins are so small. But you then extrapolate the distance out over long course, and actually, maybe the skill level doesn't quite need to be as high. It's just as important because the time saving on descents. The Ironman France or 70.3 Worlds this year is going to be a brilliant example of bike hand. I know for a fact you can take 8 minutes out of someone that's equal to you on the way up if you're faster on the way down. I've got evidence to show it. So, I thought that was pretty funny. And look, it came from we were there after Chris had been training indoors all winter. Where I'm going with the story, though, is this is the key bit. I think a lot of people come on training camps, maybe, like with me in the past, for example, and they're like, oh, I've been riding my whole life. I probably have got a higher degree of bike skill than them. And they just go, oh, I can't keep up on the descent. Whereas something like that happens to Chris with the mentality of, a very good athlete, and he immediately goes to work on solving the problem. I cannot let that gap go. It doesn't matter that, I'm sure if we'd have gone up the climb really hard the other side, he'd have probably dropped me on the way up. But he wants every little advantage he can have. So he goes, hang on, if these guys can go that fast down a hill, I can go that fast down a hill. And he's a tall guy, higher centre of gravity, definitely more difficult for him to navigate like a big hairpinny descent and stuff. And sure enough, I remember riding with him later that spring, and he's right on your wheel all the way down the descent because he's gone out of his way to make sure it doesn't happen. And I think everyone can take something from that. Don't just accept that you are where you are with skills. They can be learned, and if you're determined, you can make massive gains. If you're listening to this and you go into France later in the year for 70.3 World, do not leave this to chance. There's 8 minutes on the line, and you probably can't train your way to climb 8 minutes faster, so you need it on the descent. So, yeah.
My next point follows on really well from that. And I think it's to do with focusing on your weaknesses. So like maybe Chris's weakness at that point in time was his bike handling skills on a descent. Mine, for a large part of my career, was my swim ability. And how did I go and correct that? I moved to a place. I moved country, out to France, to train with a group of people that were really good at swimming. and learn from them and swim with them. And lo and behold, at the end of that 2 years, I think my best ever swim in a race, come out top 10 in a WTS race in the water was um, I was very chuffed with, to say the least. But the point there is, or the lesson there is, to understand what you're good at, and also understand where your comparative weaknesses are. Whilst it's always important to maintain the strength, sometimes it can be a lot more advantageous to work on that weakness and bring it up to par instead of just ignoring it and putting a band-aid over it, and maybe working hard but not really addressing the fundamental cause of why it's weak. And I think particularly, as an age group athlete that's wanting to do it for a little bit of fun, it's often not very fun to work on our weaknesses. Um, the way that I quite like to flip that is we all do sport to get better, right? And as soon as we're bad at something, we have got such a big opportunity to get better at it. And for me personally, that's where the fun is.
A few things just went through my head at the last second, hence why I paused. Yeah, I always say to athletes, I've got to be careful how this comes out of my mouth now, but like, if I tell you you're shit, that's a golden opportunity. If I said you are the best you can already be, how are you going to get any better? So the further away you are from perfect, the more chance you've got to move up. Now, look, I'm quite sure I don't use quite that terminology, but look, I think people get the point. Seeing a weakness is an opportunity, and closing that gap, and understanding that if you've been in the sport many years, and physiologically it can be quite difficult to get those little extra gains. If you learn to swim really well, or run way more efficiently, or descend on your bike better, or corner on your bike, these are big differences when you think you're already good because your power and your pace looks good. So yeah, and interestingly, you said about going to France to learn to swim. I actually think I agree. I don't think anybody likes to work on their weakness. Their weakness is also probably, like they say, something you don't enjoy. So one of the ways I found around that is do it with other people. Do it with someone better than you. Do it with someone you can observe. Do it with someone that's supportive. So I actually do some running, over the winter with Jen, and she's excellent at drills. So we stop, we do some drills. Look like I've got two left feet sometimes when I start learning them, but it's interesting because someone's teaching me, and then we carry on running, and you work on it, and it's probably the same the other way with some bike skills or some swim skills or something, and having a training partner, a training environment, the odd opportunity to go to a local run club, swim with a masters club. I think age group athletes that swim with a masters club, I've got a lot of them do it sort of once a week. I think it's brilliant. A lot of people come to us as coaches and go, "Oh, I like to swim in masters. Is that a problem if you're setting?" Absolutely not a problem. Speak to me about it. Tell me what the plan is, what the sessions are like. Is it hard? Is it easy? Is it technical? Have you got a coach that gives you good advice? And you build it into the plan. But I think, yeah, I think finding ways to work on your weaknesses with others makes those weaknesses much more enjoyable.
And that's the fun in it. Trying to get better at this thing. And triathlon, we've got such a fortunate opportunity. There's so much stuff. There's so much stuff you've got to learn that there's always an opportunity.
Oh,
And very few
absolutely.
people are good at everything. Very, very
Yeah,
few, if anybody.
yeah.
Even your world champions. Load management.
So load management, yeah. So years ago we did I got back in the day of evening webinars and recording stuff on Zoom and having to download it to YouTube, and um, we did a few sort of seminars with athletes on load management using the Training Peaks performance management chart, which I think is excellent for it. CTL, daily TSS, fatigue and form, and how that builds. It's a great way to visualize it for people, and I still use it a lot for visualization with people, for maybe season planning, maybe for putting people's mind at ease, that because you can forward plan on TSS and you can see that if they've had a bit of illness or injury, how they bounce back. And so one of the when we did this seminar, and I'll share it in the notes of the show below. Actually, it's an oldie but goldie. It's a fairly long listen, but one of the examples we used was an athlete I coached at the time. He's, it's I won't name him, but he knew I was talking about him when I was showing the data, even though it was anonymous. He wouldn't come off the gas. He had a really quite a high CTL all year long, so there was never an opportunity to create overload and recovery. And I think that's a common problem where people are maxed out with hours they can train, or just want to train all the time, don't want to take an off season, don't want to take a bit of a break after a race, and just getting the time right. And one of the things I've really observed, and I don't think the Training Peaks performance management chart is flawless. I understand the arguments as to what it's accounting for and what it's not, but I do think it tells a very good story. And the amount of times that I look at when someone's had a good result, it quite often correlates with good periods of overload and recovery and peaking at the right moment. So I think the point here on load management is taking a wide lens on how your year, or actually, when I look at athletes, I always use the 2 year view, because I want to see trend over time. I want to see mistakes they've made in the past where they maybe haven't come off it or come off it too much, and the ramp rate as to how they built and when they hit, their maximum available CTL, which with age groupers, that is the reality. You run out of hours to continue to create overload. And then observe with different athletes how those different builds work for them. So this is definitely an individualized area um, where athletes do need to learn about themselves with their coach, and what works for them. But I think the key mistakes that I see is fear of becoming unfit, which comes from a lack of understanding of, like, yes, you do lose fitness if you come off the gas for a period of time. But for example, a lot of like the hard wins, like the biological structures within the body, the changes to your heart, mitochondrial development, capillarization, they don't come and go that quickly. They're there, the machinery's there. What does change is maybe like the enzymes within the body, and stuff that helps, lactate clearance probably, and blood plasma, drops quite quickly from a period of time off. And these things do in the short term make you less fit, but they also come back quite quickly, and then the underlying machinery. So I think one of the, if we're reflecting on, and I actually don't think I made too bad a job of this throughout my career. I was quite good at taking time out and knowing you bounce back. And it's just come from 30 years of observation of it's fine to take a proper long end of season, and the machinery's there, and you do come back. So, yeah, that's my third point really, is I think athletes can be better at understanding peaks and troughs.
Yeah, I quite like that. The way I learned that, I came from Javier Gomez, legend in the sport, and his mantra was he would only train. Now, keep this in perspective, right? One of the best athletes in the world, trained a lot. He would only train twice a day up until Christmas, or up until the New Year. After the New Year, he would ramp that up. And his reasoning for that was, if I don't get unfit, then there's no way that I can get fit again. And it's just understanding if you don't have that freshness in your body, if you don't have the the drive, the chance for everything to kind of relax and reset, then it's going to be very hard to hit those new levels, or even the same levels again and again and again. And coming from somebody like that, I found it very insightful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was actually sat in a lecture actually, with Inside, listening to sort of pro cyclists and how they train, and talking actually about how they don't take these long off seasons anymore, because they can't show up for training camp unfit. The standard is so high now. But it comes with a big risk of burnout. It comes with a big risk of shorter careers. It comes with, these are paid professionals. And as I sat listening to it, and they've got to turn up for the Spring Classics in great shape, rather than they used to turn up on December training camp, 8 kilos overweight and out of shape, and then get fit. They don't do it anymore. But I think it's, these guys are I mean, professional cyclists. The race schedule's so heavy, the and the money is so big. It's a very different world to what most other endurance athletes and actually probably all triathletes are going through. And I do believe in really letting that fitness go. Now, I think what you said is when you said, like, remember the levels here. I'm not saying to someone don't do anything for 6 weeks. Like especially if you're newer to the sport and you don't have a VO2 in the 80s. It's the road back's too long, but it is about understanding. Really simple one is understand TSS and CTL, and then just go. If my CTL peaks at, let's say, 100, you don't want to be creating 80 or 90 in October, November, and December. You're never going to get the rise you want. You might want to be creating 40 or 50 a day, which is, an hour easy on the bike or a 45-minute jog. And absolutely, like you said, just accepting you are less fit at that moment, but it's just a cycle. Don't hold on to it all year round. Your peak will be higher. You'll probably be healthier. You'll have a longer career in the sport. And we talk about it with athletes a lot, don't we, in the autumn? It's skill development time. Use that time. If you really, really don't want to down tools, get less fit, develop your skills, then get fit again. You'll be way faster. Dead simple.
My point, or my lesson on this, was a phrase I quite like: "Win today by turning up tomorrow." And we're kind of, I guess, you're talking from a year long perspective, or a 2 year even long perspective. I think this kind of takes it down into that kind of microcycle from day to day, and understanding how you feel day to day, and making sure that you're kind of hitting the sessions or hitting training right, or taking the rest when you need it, so that you can turn up tomorrow to do it again and again and again. And I guess over that longer period of time, kind of bringing it into Phil's point, um, if you do this correctly, then you won't burn out the same, because you've not been hitting your head against the wall consistently for months and months on end. You've created um an achievable point of load. Maybe this is the feel based way, based on the kind of CTL that Phil's talking about. But just understanding when that fatigue is ascending too much, or at the point, and stop that before it becomes too much, so that you can turn up the next day and do it all over again.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can take it out the other way as well, can't you? Talk about, like, say, someone newer to the sport, building load over multiple years, letting the body absorb it properly. I have worked with athletes who, they're young, they're enthusiastic, they've got a bit of talent, but it's like they're absolutely on the limit of anything they'll ever be able to do in year one. And I would like to see them probably think more as a 2 to 3 year cycle to absorb the load properly and get to where they need to get to over time. Very hard thing to convince people to do. And that's not to say, don't train hard. It's just to say, you don't want a massive year one and a slightly smaller year two and an even smaller year three. That's not going to give you the gains you want. And you're probably athletes in Olympic cycles as well, when thinking about 4 year cycles, and how, they're looking at managing load over a 4 year period right at the start of that cycle, aren't they? And how they train, leading to peak performance in 4 years, which is real pressure. Look, let's dive into point number 4, and this is, I think, more and more relevant in modern times, and who knows how more relevant over the coming years with the rise of AI and stuff. But data, using it, but respecting the basics at the same time. So, where, I just gave away how long I've been doing sport. I remember getting my first heart rate monitor and thinking I was the nuts because I had a watch strapped to my handlebars, and I had data on my bike when I was a youngster, and we obviously trained by feel back then, an awful lot. But it's also not just about training by feel. It's about, obviously, like, these days we understand individual physiology. easier. We can determine it easier. We can use data to determine it. We can use data to determine how it's shifting over time, how training's taking effect. And, 30 years ago where, it was training was a bit more basic. Periodization was the way it was. Probably everyone was using traditional periodization, hence why it's called traditional. Big volume. I even remember this is how basic it used to be. You rode your bike in the small chain ring before Christmas and the big chain ring after Christmas. That basic, but it was still you were still just riding 5 hours, 6 hours, 6 times a week. So, and then you did a few sprints, and then you might start racing, and you raced your way fit. Lot different in how we train now, and I think that is one of the things that I wish we could have identified physiology differently back then. We can now, and I think that is one of the things athletes should try to really understand about themselves, because it really probably links back to point number one here about intensity, because intensity can feel different to different people as well. I think physiology plays into that, your psychology plays into it, and the types of sessions you like, the way you were introduced to the sport maybe. So yeah, using data to not just follow numbers, that's not really what I'm talking about here, but to understand physiology better to then make the most appropriate changes.
Yeah, you're right, and I think we're lucky now. You look at the even somebody getting into the sport brand new, and they've got access to information that the very best in the world didn't have access to 20, 30 years ago. And in using that information correctly can sometimes be a challenge, and especially if you don't know what you don't know. But there's an opportunity there. There's an opportunity to train well. There's an opportunity to use the data appropriately to inform those decision making, those decisions that you make. We always speak about triangulating the data. With most or a large percentage of athletes now have all those data points at their fingers, and maybe making good use of that.
Do you think it's one of the key skills in a modern coach is to be able to understand how much to leverage data and when to leverage it?
Yeah, yeah, because and we've spoken about this before, but the flip side of that, you become too reliant on the data, and you don't develop the same skills of feel like perhaps you did when you were a youngster, or even I did when I was a youngster. I remember when I got my first GPS watch, and it was this big chunky thing sticking out my arm. There's the GPS monitor. But yeah, understanding when to use it and when not to
And
is
and
a bit of a skill.
and I think a lot of athletes they they don't a lot of people like there's so much data and it can create confusion. But they probably where they need to upskill is in both areas, understanding the data fully, understanding the basics, RPE, how you feel, just um, making sensible choices, and just thinking about things holistically. But I guess that's why a lot of people look for a coach. People living busy lives. There's a lot of stuff to think about there. It's nearly easier for them to just express how they feel and upload some data. And as a coach, we can sort of like dive into that. But where I think it's most successful is where athletes who, if you're listening this far into this podcast, you're probably pretty interested in developing in this area. And that's when I think the coach athlete relationship's at its most successful. When it's not just the coach that has the skills with the data and the basics, the athlete has a fairly high understanding of it as well. Where the coach's role then sits is to unemotionally pull apart the basics and the data and provide feedback as to how to move forward, whereas the athlete is attached emotionally to to a lot of decisions and even the way they view the data. Whereas it's a lot easier for us to look at it without emotional attachment. And I actually think with a lot of the guys and girls I work with, that is it's one of my major functions. Actually, I've got quite a lot of like experienced athletes who do understand most of this, but a lot of it is dealing with it in the right context.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're right there, and it made me think a little bit like the new athlete getting into the sport. How much data do they need to look at? Do they need to see? And how much of it is just feeding back how things feel, and over time, just teaching why they're feeling that way, and maybe what they're feeling, and gradually get to the point where exactly like you said,
I think
it's they
your
understand.
comment earlier on the utilization of hitting exact paces whilst so you're using data whilst also thinking about the basics to get execution of threshold correct. That probably is like a modern world, I, I think to sit here and think that you're going to get someone new into the sport and go, right, don't buy a power meter, don't buy a watch, don't do, look, buying shiny things, half the attractions of the sport. And also I do, as a coach, you do need the data uploaded. You do need to see what's going on. But do you when someone's very new? I don't know. Let's not go down that rabbit hole on today's conversation. But yeah, I think yeah, like we said, it's very much about like leveling the athlete up here in both areas. If I was a um, if I was in my early part of the sport now, or looking to keep moving my level up, I'm looking to just keep the wolf from the door these days. So I would very much want to do some testing, or and I wasn't someone that tested a lot during my the main part of my triathlon career because I think I had a good feel, I sort of knew where things were at. But what I didn't know was where my physiology was always at. You could make an assumption about someone, but one thing I've learned over the years is even a good coach can make incorrect assumptions, for sure, on physiology, and getting a bit of hard data on that is quite important. You could like think an athlete based off their results and performances and outputs. He's quite an aerobic athlete. You do some testing with him, and actually, maybe the glycolytic system's a little bit high, and it could be optimized further. And especially when you've got good athletes, you like I said earlier, you're not going to get huge gains. So I would very much want to understand my physiology. I'd want to monitor it a few times of the year. We've talked in the past about, we use Inside because it's cost effective and easy to administer on athletes. I won't go into what it is today. I'll put a link in the show notes on it. Over, say, go in the lab. And I do see it as a much more gold standard approach than certainly an FTP test or a park run or whatever the basic levels of testing are that don't really give you an idea on physiology. Critical power, using short and long duration tests or power duration curve. I think these are all pretty good ways to get a handle on someone. But I think if it was me, for the relatively small investment in getting some solid gold standard testing, I probably would if I was serious about the sport, and then obviously work with someone that knows how to build a plan based on it.
You know, just as you said that, I reflected back on my time with testing, and when I was kind of coming through sport, I got tested yearly and would be shown a number. Um, this is where your threshold is. This is what your VO2 max is, and nobody would ever do anything with that number, or with those numbers. And so very very quickly I said, "Well, this is a waste of time. I'm not going to do testing anymore." And that was a decision I kind of stood by. Reflecting back and knowing what I know now, exactly as you said, I wish I tested more. I understood my physiology more at a younger age, or certainly earlier in my career, so that I could make better decisions about how I trained and how I spent my time training, and have some objectivity around that. Um, I think data definitely does drive better decision making. Um, with training, yeah, 100%. If I were to have my time again, I would learn. more about it?
We've got it available to us, and we didn't used to have it available. I love coaching with it. I love, you never lean just on the data. That's not how you work, and but it allows you to just make nuanced decisions for the athlete, and it does get better results. Especially when the one thing I've noticed certainly over the last year and a half, using Inside, is those athletes I've worked with a long time that maybe have felt a little bit stuck at certain numbers, um, have managed to unleash that sort of like next level, just through just being pointed in the right direction, and them. It's a combo, as you said, them understanding the physiology and me understanding the physiology. I then build the plan off it, they execute the sessions well off it, and you get that next game. Do I think if I was new to the sport and doing this just for fun, I would want to go to that level of understanding? No, I would want to make sure that I was doing all of like the right amount of training, maximizing that, definitely doing some testing, but not overcomplicating it. Maybe in year 1 and 2, get yourself with a good engine, then start to understand the physiology. I think a good coach with someone in the very early days can determine the right training that's needed, the physiology of the athlete well enough. I think it's when you starting to then go, right, how do we move you on again? So certainly probably I would want someone to have been in the sport for in endurance sport in general for a little while, to have built a bit of an engine. I don't know whether you agree with that or not.
Yeah, 100%. Listen, if you are new to endurance sport, just swim, cycling, running, you're going to get better to an extent. Making sure that you're doing the right amount of
Yeah.
that, that's probably where a coach comes in, and educating around all the intricacies of triathlon, which there are many. Yeah, is important. My very last point, and this probably comes at a poignant moment for me, learning to listen to the body with injury. And I say that because I tweaked a calf last week. Um, so the joys of sport. But early on in my career, whenever I felt something, I would try and ignore it. I would hide it from my coach, because I knew as soon as I told my coach something was sore, something was injured, they would say rest. I don't want to.
I know athletes are hiding something from me when they go quiet, with quite a few of them. So the minute
100%.
feedback
Listen,
stops, it's
everybody's the
like, what?
same.
Oh, you're still training. You're not feeding back. What's up? Oh, been ill for a few days. I didn't want to tell you. Yeah.
Um, I get it. I get it. I've been there. You've probably been there yourself. But
No, I'm a moaner. I just moan about it.
oh, fair enough. But at my old age, can I say that yet? No, I can't.
No, you can't.
I think most of the athletes I coach are older than me. But I now can't be bothered being injured. Um, and stopping at the first sign of something being wrong is so much better. It's literally go easy for a couple of days, rest for a couple of days, and 9 times out of 10 you'll be fine. Or crack on for those next couple of days, do the next hard session, and bang, something goes. Um, yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's my.
I mean that's what you're talking about there is basics, isn't it? There's no data can really. Well, there is a bit of data, I guess. If you're ill, maybe you can react to the data. But I think, yeah, absolutely, listening to the body, it can't be overlooked really, and because consistency is key. So yeah, yeah. Look, good. I mean, look, I think we've covered four fairly good points there. Execute intensity with knowledge and precision. Train skills, not just fitness. Manage your load across the week, the month, the year, multiple years. And yeah, definitely use data these days, but right data at the right time, never ever forgetting the basics, and probably never used without context, and context is basics. So yeah, look, I think Grant spent years putting his body right to the limit, and probably talks very 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 well self-educated on all of these observations, and I've obviously been around an awful long time, so I hope we've brought something to you guys today to help you train a bit smarter. Whether you're newer to the sport and there's a lot to absorb there, or whether you've been in the sport a bit longer and we've maybe said one or two things that you can get hold of and take forward, and just do a little bit better, because that's what it comes down to when you're a bit more experienced.
Yeah, I think, listen, go back to what we said at the start about, recognising patterns. And when you've been in the sport a while, the same mistakes crop up again and again and again. And hopefully, this helps those that have kind of had a little bit of a listen and they don't make the same mistakes that we've done many, many times.
We worked with a great physio up in the Cheshire area, a guy called Lee Halftech, for years, and I'll just finish on this anecdote. And we sent an awful lot of athletes his way. He's excellent, works with British Athletics, and he what happened over time was I started realizing that the feedback that's coming. He was seeing the same thing over, and I said to him one day, I said, "You just give people the same exercises because you just keep seeing the same injuries. You know, weak glutes do this, poor calf capacity does this. You're neurally tight here, here, and here." And he just said, yeah, absolutely. You do over time see the same. It's how he could identify problems so quickly, because he's seen the same thing repetitively so many times. And it's the same with us coaches, isn't it? We do. I think. Look, I think I like athletes to listen to these podcasts because it brings their level of knowledge up, and it stops us having the same conversation over and over again and moves us to the next level, because the next level is far more beneficial for them as an athlete, because it becomes more individualized and more nuanced for them. A lot of the same general conversations probably can be learned from this podcast, other podcasts, Chat GPT. We're here for like that next level, really. So
100%. 100%.
good.
So,
Thanks, buddy. Good chat. And we will. I am heading to. I'm not sure if it is sunny in Mallorca, but I'm heading to Mallorca, so we'll be back in 10 days or so.
yeah, well, none of us feel sorry for you.
No, I'm sure.
Have a good week, guys.
Take care. Cheers.